Let's open Blender Launcher. If you don't have Blender Launcher, I highly recommend it. It's a very useful tool. Blender Launcher is free to use and it allows you to have, it's actually got an interesting amount of customization here. Some of it I haven't even used, but you can always decide to launch Blender Launcher when your system starts. But this folder is going to be the folder where all of your Blender installations are going to go. I have mine right on my desktop. So these are all my Blender installations, and you can see I have versions from 4.0.2 all the way to 3.3.4. You can download versions that are years and years old. The earliest version you can download directly from their archive. But if you want later versions, you want to stick to the LTS series. I believe the latest LTS is 3.3.14 or 15, 3.3.16. But I have all the way to 4.0.2 installed, and that's what I'm going to launch here. So Blender 4.0.2 is launched, and you can see that we have a cube. Now, this cube is 2 meters big. If you hit N, you can reveal this panel and all of the other subsequent panels. These panels will show up whenever and change depending on whether you're in edit mode or in object mode. So if you're not seeing the same thing that I'm seeing, you may want to make sure that you're either in object mode or edit mode accordingly based off of what I'm working on. Okay, so you can always tell whether you're in edit mode or object mode because you'll go from having an outline to having almost a hologram overlay of your object. So while we're in object mode, I'm going to go ahead and turn on screencast keys. This will allow you to see what I'm clicking and how I'm moving around. Okay, so now you can see I hit tab to go back into edit mode and back into object mode. So if you're worried about what key I'm hitting, you can look right in this area. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit N and I'm going to hide these panels for now. The next thing we need to do, actually, I'm going to show you. This cube is 2 meters wide and long and deep. So we want to go ahead and make this not 2 meters. It needs to be something like millimeters. Now, we can go to micrometer precision if we want to, but we want to go ahead and at least get to millimeters for now. So let's start by scaling our item. Well, now we're working in fractions of meters, and that might still be too big. A meter is 1,000 millimeters, and we can't see the decimal places for that. So we need to change our scene units. So on the property stack, if we go down the stack and we look at scene settings, we can click on units, make sure this is set to metric, and then we can set this to millimeters. Now, Blender struggles whenever it comes to certain precision or certain levels of precision, but we can overcome that by manually entering settings. The same kind of thing that you'll probably have to do in Fusion 360. It struggles from the same issues. Okay, so now we can see that our cube is 2,000 millimeters. Let's try scaling it. If we scale it, we can actually drag this to rescale, and you'll notice that it's moving in 100 millimeter increments. If I hold Shift, it'll go in smaller increments, 10 or 20 millimeters at a time. That's handy, but I feel like we can do a better job of this. If we just click on it, we can go to 235, 235, 235. Oops, let me correct that. 235. Now, we've set our scale to 235, but you might notice later, and you probably will as you're editing, that things aren't really scaling properly. Things are being wonky. And you're going to know that there is something wrong. There's a disparity between what you're changing and what you're trying to do and what's actually happening. And that's because our size, our scale of our object hasn't been applied yet. Right now, the scale is 0.118. Well, that's because we resized our object by modifying its dimensions physically and not modifying the mesh inside. If we want to see how big our mesh is inside, we're going to have to set something real quick. So in edit mode, in our mesh edit mode overlays, we can come down and we can turn on the edge length. Now we can see our actual scale of our object is about 2,000 millimeters wide. Since our scale didn't get applied, the mesh and the object scale are different. So let's go ahead and hit Control A and apply our scale. Now our scale reads 111, which matches up to our dimensions 235. And if we look inside of the edit mode and look at the mesh, the distance between our edges is 235. So now that we've set that, let's go ahead and get the rest of this cube looking more like a build area. So we want to go ahead and we want to move our object up. But you'll notice that it's kind of hard to get it to align perfectly to that grid. We want to snap the bottom of this cube to this grid plane. The reason we want to do that is because the grid plane itself is going to get in it's going to obstruct our view while we're working later. And we want to go ahead and put it below our object so we can still see the grid and we can use it, but it doesn't interfere with what we're working on and confuse us, distract us. So let's go ahead and turn on our snapping modes. Now, you have a few options here: transformation orientation, pivot, snapping, and proportional editing. Let's go ahead and turn on snapping. And let's make sure that we're in the increment view. So increment snapping will allow us to move our cube up or down along a grid, a three-dimensional grid. Or it'll allow us to move incrementally, which just happens to align with our grid right now. So let's go ahead and change the size of our increments, because you notice that it's moving about a meter at a time right now, which is far too much. You can see how far it's moving over here in the transform tab inside of our different location settings. So we want to change the increment. Let's change it to, well, it's 1,000 millimeters per meter. That's 3 decimal places. You notice the grid changed? And if we zoom in, our grid subdivides. So now if we hit G and Z, it's snapping, but we can't see how well it's snapping or what it's snapping to. If we hit 1 on our numpad and we zoom way in, 1, we can see that it is definitely snapping in increments. So if we hit 3, 1, 3, that's 7. Okay, so Z is up and down. Let's go ahead and hit 1, and let's hit G and Z and move it up. Okay, it's going to snap. We want to go until we can see the red line. There's the red line. We zoom in some more. How much is it moving at a time? It's moving 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. We zoom in as far as it'll let us. We can see that it is perfectly aligned where it needs to be. And that's the perspective shadow. You can move this up, back down, and you can see that the perspective shadow is intersecting. It's actually the near clipping plane that's intersecting with our view. And what we can do is we can go to View, set the clip start to 1 millimeter. If we hit 1 again, we can zoom all the way back in. Now you might notice that this is actually cutting off one of these squares. It's cutting off this square, and we're not getting the precision that we would hope for. Well, that's because we're in 235 millimeters and it's splitting a millimeter to put the center of our cube in the center of the world. If we had a 236 millimeter area, then it would be different. But we've got 235. So we're going to have to settle for about 0.5 millimeter on either side of the cube. So it's going to split one of our grid squares, and then it's centered. So that's what that looks like. It's perfect. So now if we set this cube in its object settings, viewport, display, and bounds, if we set this to a box, then we can display as bounds. And now we have a nice hollow cube. So if we add a new object and we set it to something we can actually see, now we can see that it's inside of our build area, and we know where our build area is. We have a couple of problems we need to assess though. First, our new cube is actually below the grid plane. We'll fix that in a second just by G, Z, and moving it upward again. And if we hit 1, we just do the same thing where we bring it into the space that it needs to be in. So now it's perfectly inside of our build area. Now if we select our build area, oh, that's probably important to cover. If you accidentally select your build area and you make changes to it, then you might not be able to get it back, and it's a whole lot of setup to do this again. So let's make sure that we can't accidentally select it. If we come over here to the filters toggle, the drop down, we can turn on the selectable restriction toggle, just so you know where it's at. Now we have a restriction toggle we can turn on for our build area. And so we can set this to build that's not a word, volume overlay. There you go. While we're here, the camera and the light may not be necessary. So I'm going to hold Control, select both of these, and I'm going to hit X. When you're deleting something, just so you know, if you're inside of the viewport and you hit X, you'll get a delete prompt. When you're inside of the outliner, which is this panel, then you will not get a prompt. So you may accidentally delete something you didn't mean to delete. Be extra careful with your selections while you're inside of the outliner. Okay, so now that we have our build area, we made it not selectable, we have our cube ready to get started modeling, we can go ahead and finish configuring our viewport. So if you notice, the viewport has these different panels. Some of them are going to be useful, but the playback panel is for animations and VFX and all kinds of other things that you may need to set up at some point for animation, but you're not going to be using it for 3D printing. So we can go ahead and get rid of it. If you wait until you see the double arrow icon and then you right click and join areas, you notice the cursor has now changed. It's a chevron. Wherever the chevron is, that's the panel that's going to disappear. So if you right click, join areas, and then click on the panel you want to disappear, it will go away. Now, if you make the mistake of deleting the wrong panel, don't worry. All you have to do is right-click vertical split, right-click horizontal split, and now you have multiple viewports. And this is actually handy because you can change the render view, the shading of each viewport independently. So this is handy when you want to see a matte cap while you're also doing wireframing, while you're also doing sculpting. But for the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and set this panel to be the property stack, this panel to be the outliner, and we can go ahead and shrink this sidebar back down. So if you do manage to screw up your layout worse than that, and you just want to reset back to 0 really fast, you can do that. All you have to do is come over to the layout tab, right click and delete. And whenever you add your layout back, then it's going to have the default settings. So we just join areas and get rid of that again, and we're good to go. This should reset back to its original position after you've reloaded Blender, but for now it's going to be stuck right there, unfortunately. Sorry about that. So now that we're basically ready to start modeling or sculpting, we can go ahead and we can save our project. If you're done modeling something and you're ready to export it, if you come over to File and Export, you'll have the STL option. If you don't have the STL option, go to Edit, Preferences, and in Add-ons, type ST, not SY, ST, and you can even type L if you want to, but there it is right there. You just click on this checkbox. Oops, it's gone, and it's back. Whenever you install a plugin, you're going to have to wait for it to show up with a checkbox, and then you can enable your plugin right there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save my preferences. And you can always edit your edge length text if you come to viewports, or sorry, if you come to themes, 3D viewports, and you can scroll down until you see it say edge length text, and then you can set the edge length. And we can preview that right now. I can select all of my faces, edge length text, I can set the color of it, and you can see what that looks like. That's pretty cool. Okay, so go ahead and save that again. I know you can auto save, but sometimes it's better just to manually save it in case it crashes. Okay, so we're all set up and good to go. I already have a 3D modeling template set up, so I'm not going to save this one. But whenever you're ready to export, just make sure that you are only exporting the things that you have selected by clicking selection only. If you're still working in meters, you may want to change the scale as well, or set it to respect the scene unit. Okay, apply modifiers is also a good one to have turned on. Sometimes you'll have modifiers set, and if you export your model and it looks like the modifiers didn't actually work, well, then you need to set the apply modifiers in the export. So now our scene is fully configured for modeling for 3D printing.